Hi everyone, Aaron Brooker here, agronomist for Michigan and Northern Indiana. Today I'm out in the soybean field and just wanted to talk about some things as we get into the middle of August here and finish out the season. Some common issues we start to see pop up in soybeans and some things I get a lot of questions about year in and year out that I just wanted to prep you on as you are out scouting your beans, and you may see some of these issues come up throughout the season. The first thing is going to be some of those late season diseases that we start to see come up. And late season is a little bit of a misnomer with the couple of diseases I'm going to talk about because they actually infect the plants early on. So the two diseases I want to point out are going to be brown stem rot and sudden death syndrome. We typically this time of year start to see some of those symptoms start to come up, and you can see those in the picture here, that the yellowing on these leaves, it's very noticeable pattern. The yellowing and brown there, it's an interveinal pattern, so it mostly stays in between those veins. We get that yellowing, but it very quickly turns to that necrosis as well. So very noticeable leaf symptomology there. When we split the stems though, that's important to do with these diseases. The brown stem rot tends to have that center of the stem turn brown where that normally is white. And then with sudden death syndrome, it's outside of that center of the stem, outside of that pith, that tends to get discolored, a little bit of browning there. But I've had samples that I've thought were brown stem rot, I've thought were sudden death, and they came out the other. So a lot of times, if we really want to know what the disease is, we need to send that in. The key here though, both of these diseases tend to infect early on. V1, V2 tend to be in wet situations, compacted situations, just not ideal growing situations early on in the season is when our plants aren't doing very well, and these pathogens tend to infect those plants. So anything we can do to correct those in future years, if we do have a problem, it's going to help alleviate these diseases. There's really no rescue treatments as far as that goes. The next thing I wanted to talk about, something we typically see symptoms start to show up this time of year as well, it's going to be soybean cyst nematode. So what do symptoms look like for soybean cyst nematode? Well, that's a small parasitic worm basically that's feeding on the roots. It doesn't cause any specific symptoms, but we might see stunting, we might see just general chlorosis or yellowing out there, might look like some nutrient deficiency, and it usually is going to occur in small patches of the field. They tend to be pretty sporadically distributed throughout the field. If you see something field wide, it's probably not this pest, but if you see just random spots, maybe in some sandy areas, high pH areas, those types of things, it could be something where we want to sample for that pest. How we'll sample for that? You can do that anytime, starting now, even throughout the end of the season, and as we get into harvest are great times to sample for these. And we basically, if you have a soil probe, that's probably going to be our best bet. You can do this with a shovel as well. Make sure you're just getting a lot of sub samples to make that full sample. Don't just go out with one spot in that shovel with that shovel. So you're going to take this, try to get some root material, go in the root zone where those nematodes are going to be at to get an accurate sample, and go to that 6 to 8 inch depth, that rooting zone depth that we typically have. And I like to go in right next to the plants. I even sometimes go on at a little angle, trying to get down into those roots a little bit and trying to get a good sample of what cysts, eggs, and live worms we actually have out there. Now, I like doing that this time of year diagnostically. If we've got some problems out there, we can visually see where those could be. So it's an easy time of year as we get over the next couple of months to see where those symptoms are. You can go out after harvest, right after harvest. It's going to be easier to get through the fields, and you can still go into that row and get that root tissue as well and see what's out there. So in Michigan, we do have those samples covered by the checkoff dollars. So feel free to send those in to Michigan State. They'll sample those, or they will analyze those and give you counts on what they find in there, and then give recommendations on what to do if you do have problems. And then in Indiana, those can be sent to Purdue down there to get those results as well. The last thing I want to talk about, we always tend to have insects this time of year. Japanese beetles are going to be the big one, occasionally bean leaf beetle, some other minor pests that may come up, but Japanese beetles are typically the one that we see. They're going to have that webbing type of feeding that you see that I can show in the picture here. And the key thing to remember, most of the time in Michigan this far north, we're not going to reach that economic threshold to need to spray for these, even though it might look bad. So that threshold here is going to be around 20% defoliation. So you can see what that looks like with this defoliation chart. And 20% looks a lot worse than 20%. So the other key to that is this feeding is typically worst on the top part of the plant. If we look down into that canopy, the feeding isn't usually that bad, and that 20% needs to be kind of an average throughout the canopy. So typically it's not worthwhile to spray in Michigan outside of a few rare occasions, but it can be on occasion worthwhile to spray, but typically we just don't see that high enough threshold up here this far north with these pests. So with that, those are the, I guess, 3 or 4 things that I wanted to touch on. Problems that may come up in fields as you're out scouting. Typical things we see this time of year as we get into August and September start to show up in our soybean fields. And as you're out scouting fields, just wanted to have you prepared with what you may see. Thanks a lot.